Okay, good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's structured conversation, Building a Culture of Co-Curricular Assessment, Where to Start, with Joe Levy, MS, Senior Assessment Manager for Co-Curricular Assessment at the University of Phoenix. My name is Mary Lee Demeter, and I will serve as your moderator today. On behalf of the SAAL Professional Development Committee, I thank you for participating in today's structured conversation. I also want to thank Mr. Levy, the SAAL Professional Development Committee, Margot Saltonstall, Shelly Ann Pheasant, and their colleagues from Northern Arizona University for all of their help in putting today's presentation together. A few logistics before we get started. Please feel free to adjust the size of your chat box here on my left to more closely monitor our conversation as you wish. Just grab the little drag drop arrow and you can size that to your liking. I encourage you to participate by asking questions and sharing comments and providing feedback either through using the chat feature here or by asking questions directly using your microphone. If you wish to use your microphone, simply raise your hand throughout the presentation and I can unmute you. You can also use the emoticons located above the chat window. We have on the left you'll see a little smiley face where you can insert a smiley face or a little LOL. Next to that icon, you can indicate to others that you've stepped away from the session. The third icon in with the little hand, please press that if you'd like to raise your hand, and I can unmute your mic to speak. And finally, we'll be conducting a few polls today throughout our session, so please use this little icon with the A in it to respond to the polls that we'll have for you today. Again, while we are primarily using the chat room for questions and comments, again, please feel free to raise your hand and speak into your mic. I can unmute you. So without further ado, let's get started with today's conversation. Again, it's building a culture of co-curricular assessment, where to start. So whether you're new to a position or a university, or whether you're new to co-curricular student affairs assessment, getting started can be difficult. Sometimes you don't have all the information or resources you need, but the directive to lead assessment still remains. This structured conversation will explore facets of preparation and getting started, considerations for guiding the work, and suggestions for advancing culture or going beyond baseline activity. Contextual examples and lessons learned from the facilitator will also be provided, while also allotting time to engage feedback in the field and Q&A from participants. So we hope that if you have any best practices, you'll share them with us today. After participating in today's conversation, we hope that you'll achieve the following learning goals: the ability to identify at least two considerations in preparing for assessment work, the ability to explain the importance of framing assessment work to involve parties, and to be able to describe at least two ways to expand assessment culture. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our discussion leader today. Joe Levy is the Senior Assessment Manager for Co-Curricular Assessment at the University of Phoenix. He has worked locally on campuses as well as served as consultant for various institutions to lead, foster, and develop strong and successful cultures of assessment. Joe is passionate about data-driven decision-making, accountability, and promoting a student-centered approach both inside and outside of the classroom. He earned his MS in Student Affairs and Higher Education from Colorado State University and his BA in English from Baldwin Wallace College in Ohio. Now sit back, relax, and join the conversation as Joe helps us understand directive assessment and building a culture in the co-curricular assessment of student affairs. So welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Merle. Hi, everybody. Hopefully audio's pretty clear for me. I know some folks were saying some muddy audio, but hopefully we're good to go here. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do to start off is I wanted to give some context to my career and where I'm coming from, especially if I'm talking about building a culture of co-curricular assessment. I'm by no means an expert, but I wanted to share what has helped form my approach and experience with co-curricular assessment aside from texts and literature in the field. But One thing that really helped me was I worked as an assessment consultant for Campus Labs, and during that time, personally worked with about a little over 40 campuses over the course of 2.5 years, which was great to watch the culture change and see how some cultures can change faster than others at different institutions. But then also while there in talking with some of the other consultants, really was exposed to a lot of different campuses and what they were doing with assessment. And then most recently, while I'm at University of Phoenix now, most recently came from Western International University, where when I was hired as the director of assessment, the institution was already on notice for assessment with our accreditor HLC, and we had a lot of work to do. And so in less than 2 years, we did some pretty major remapping and more formal curriculum mapping on the academic side of the house. On the co-curricular side, we've been doing some very informal assessment, more operational type things, but certainly not in all the areas that we should have. So led 9 different areas in articulating outcomes and then mapping those accordingly to higher level divisional or university learning areas. And then most importantly, increased actions from assessment. Those numbers are not typos. Again, we had a lot of room to grow, and when you're not necessarily doing formal assessment, it's easy to achieve 100 or 1,000% increases of assessment activity. But more than anything, I've had experience taking cultures from basically 0 to a pretty healthy state. And so I hope that this presentation will, for folks newer to assessment, give a good playbook to follow or things to consider. For those who have been in assessment, a different perspective, or perhaps presenting some components in a different light. I know for me, even putting together this content was helpful in reminding myself to keep certain expectations and take a step back from the work that I'm doing now and ensure that I'm practicing what I preach. And as Marilee had mentioned, we have some built-in opportunities, poll questions, and then I'll also be happy to answer questions throughout and leave some time at the end for questions too. So really hope to capitalize on the folks that are attending, and yeah, hope you enjoy the presentation. I just wanted to give a quick outline so you know what's coming. The way I'm presenting this information is talking about assessment work, the preparation you can be doing before launching. So potentially if you're new to the institution or if you're looking to undertake a new approach, that's something you can, preparation work and considerations, context setting that you can, that needs to take place, actually doing the assessment work, and once you're up and running, then also thinking about a next level assessment, or once you have a foundation, how to build upon that foundation. And then some final tips or lessons learned from my perspective, and also hoping to get some of that feedback from you all as well. So to kick things off, I wanted to just see, given our audience, considering the outline, which of those areas are you most interested, or are you most excited to hear information or see what I have to share? As Marilee mentioned, you can use the little button on the participant area underneath your name. It currently says A, but you can, by clicking that, you can then vote A through E according to the responses on the page there, and it'll start posting the responses. And we'll just pause a moment for folks to locate that button and weigh in with their perspective. And once we have some participation there, Marilee will look to post those results. But if nothing else, it is also just helpful for me to know where to potentially pause for more questions, or especially if it's an area of most interest, seeing if others also have particular specific questions or particular insight to share in addition to what I presented. All right, looks like we have, yeah, 3, 2, 1. We have a decent amount of folks having responded. All right, so it looks like the majority of folks are most interested in executing as a leader or coordinator of assessment. So yeah, really doing the work and helping to kind of maintain that work that's taking place. And then folks interested in just anything and everything, as well as context setting and then some assessment preparation. Great, thanks for weighing in, and away we go. So preparation, one of the biggest things to look to do is first understand what is the existing culture or what existing practices are taking place, because you may have grand plans or ideas, but often it's helpful to first take stock of what's there, and also to make sure to be talking with folks and looking to understand what they may be doing in general, perhaps leaving assessment out of the conversation, because I think sometimes, especially if assessment is new, using that terminology that people don't necessarily understand, they may not think about things that they're doing that could qualify as assessment, and they may not think to bring that up to you. So it's helpful to talk with folks, get to understand their areas, as well as just how they're operating, so that you know what's going on, and then can also think of knowing the existing practices, what you may want to do there. In order to do that, one of the things too is to identify who's involved and also who's not involved. One of the things at my institution that at University of Phoenix in particular is that there were a number of areas that I would consider traditional co-curricular or student affairs areas who did not think they were that, or didn't think they fell into that category. And I'm sure other institutions, I know, I think it was SAAL, or at least some listserv a couple months ago was even going back and forth, getting advice from different assessment professionals on how to exactly qualify or define co-curricular or student affairs areas for assessment, given that within the organizational chart, there are some areas that actually live on the academic side of the house, and others who at some institutions are included in student affairs assessment and others that are not. So it's helpful to be clear of who's involved and who you want to be involved so that you can engage those folks. And as we then know who may be involved and what they're doing, you want to think about what your approach is going to be, because you should have a plan, and also be aware as you're thinking about approach if there's approval to be obtained, and I want to make sure to mention that, especially because we don't want to fall into a trap of assessment, everything assessment being dictated by an office, when almost all accreditation criteria will say on the academic side of the house, assessment should be faculty driven, and on the co-curricular student affairs side of the house, that the areas, the staff members from those areas should be leading those efforts. So while it's great to have the guidance and perspective of assessment professionals, we truly need to be playing a supportive role, although that support is pretty heavy early on the onset of the process, especially if assessment activity hasn't been taking place there. But we'll circle back to that component of the role of the assessment professional later. So you somewhat have two options with setting an approach. The first being that you can adapt an existing model. So there are And there could be an internal existing model of assessment that you want to largely take and maybe revamp or add to or potentially continue as is, but just involve more people or formalize some of the processes. Then there's also external models that you can utilize. I put AACMU, CAS, and then there may be specific campuses that you look up to who are leaders in assessment or are doing things that you think would be great on your campus. There's nothing wrong with taking those models and trying to adapt them to your own institution. Obviously, the pro there is that there's a framework that you can then look to integrate. But there's also the drawbacks of this being something foreign to the institution, and folks perhaps wondering, well, who are they, or that doesn't fit us. We're such a unique institution. But certainly something to consider, especially if you're getting started and maybe don't know where to begin. It's also great to look at different examples, find common elements, even if you're going to build your own, to just see what else is out there. And with that, especially if whether it's an external model or an internal model, understand your liberties or know where you can deviate from the script. Perhaps you might be stuck with an existing model on campus and you have to keep running with that. That's okay. Just know where you can grow and know where perhaps the pain points are that you can try to alleviate or remove some barriers. And again, this goes back to the understanding existing practices, trying to understand what works or doesn't work for people with the existing model, and see where there's flexibility for change there, and go from there. The other major option then is creating a new model, which it can be very exciting to know that you have a blank canvas, or to know that you have leadership support or the institutions in place that you're able to roll out your dream assessment plan. Again, I've been in that position. It's very exciting, but it's also very challenging, especially if it's something brand new. You're going to have to navigate the challenge of changing an institutional culture and informing people of this new process or this new practice. It can take a lot of work and a lot of time, but if it's what you and others think is best for the institution, it's worth that trade-off. But certainly you want to have, ideally you want to have an approach or a larger model as you're looking to get started, so that you can reference back to and ground different areas in their work, so that it doesn't seem ad hoc, especially on the student affairs or co-curricular side, where what one office does for assessment can look wildly different from another office. Having those guiding principles of a model, or general expectations of a timeline with which people are going to be assessing their outcomes and reporting is helpful. So I wanted to check in and see which best describes your co-curricular strategy at your institution, given assessment models. Are you adapting an existing external model, or looking to adapt an existing external model? Are you working with an existing internal or homegrown model? Are you, or have you created something new? Or are you in the category of you're just trying to get assessment moving forward, and at this point you can't think about a larger model. You're just trying to work with individuals to be doing the work, and once there's at least a baseline, then you can reflect back and see how you can mold that into a particular model or not. So use your vote button like we did before. We're getting some votes coming in. Fairly's going to look to publish soon. All right. Looks like the majority of folks have adapted external models, which makes sense. I mean, what's nice about external models is that typically they have existed. Well, I'm sorry, it's a split of the external and the internal. And yeah, there's pros and cons of that, as well as the other thing too with this model component is that the model can change. Certainly if you're getting started with an external model and you look to utilize that, and then while you're employing that, you identify things that work, things that don't work, and ways you can deviate or make it your own. Likewise, too, with an existing internal model, you could potentially look at what works well or what consistent components show up in successful external models and work to build or incorporate some of those components in your model as it grows. But again, just helpful information to know our audience as well as see the diversity in approaches here. And we have one brave soul who's creating the new model and a couple folks there who are just trying to get through and will maybe consider model in the future. So as you're still doing this prep work and again thinking of assessment models and what you can do at the institution, one big thing to consider is the workflow or the potential workflow. Be thinking ahead of what's going to need to be put in place as you roll this out so that you're not necessarily charging people with a task to do and then them coming with questions of, well, how do we do this, or what happens next, and you not having those answers. Especially if it's a new model, you want to almost project manage it and think of where the end goal is and work backwards of all the pieces and parts that need to be put in place. One of the other pieces here, especially with assessment that is important, is identifying different stakeholders or entities that need to be involved. So maybe you're working with career services and you've engaged them and they're on board, but then you're going to have to talk to the people who manage the student information system or understand who holds the access to different survey platforms or databases so that you can both work with them to understand what reporting possibilities are available and identify people to connect with so that when you have questions and are prepared to collect data that you have folks in the wings that you can consult or bring in. And one of the other things with the workflow component is try to let different audiences identify who's going to be involved. You might want to work with the director of an office, but they might have, often with especially co-curricular assessment, and especially if it's new, that's a very, very small portion of their larger responsibilities and charges for their position, and especially if they're getting started, you may be looking to work with other folks within the office, or perhaps it's easier for them to have a little committee or focus group of people to be working on assessment. So just make sure to, while you may want one contact from each office, be aware of their needs and also what might work best for you. If that director is very, very busy and hard for you to get on their calendar to meet and talk about assessment, it could work to your advantage to be meeting with somebody else in that office who's more available in order to get them started and be more in regular contact with them in getting assessment work going. You also, in considering workflow, you also want to think about timelines. So one of the things that may happen when you start to engage folks to talk about assessment is they may say, so what are we working towards, or what do I need to do and by when? So have an idea of long-term, near-term, or long-term, mid-term, and short-term goals. The long-term component of what are you hoping that they do in a couple years, or perhaps maybe even just when they should have a final assessment report, and then more midterm goal of when you expect them to be collecting data, and the short-term goal of when you expect them to have an assessment plan or their outcomes articulated. But regardless of what those timeline elements are, make sure to, on your own, be building in soft deadlines, because especially if assessment is new for folks, people are not going to be necessarily hitting the deadlines that you set. Likewise, if people perhaps move faster than you may have anticipated, it's nice to have some flexibility in what you're telling them in terms of deadlines so that you can keep them going. One of the components too with the soft deadline piece is, again, going back to faculty and staff primarily driving assessment from their areas. At every institution I've been involved in, while assessment people have some power and they're typically exuding leadership and authority through influence as opposed to any type of direct report relationship. So the dirty secret amongst assessment professionals is that while we're helping lead these efforts, ultimately when it comes to deadlines, assessment people aren't the ones that can hold somebody to a deadline. You have to, if you're working with faculty, you have to go to deans or the provost or people who actually the faculty report to in order to hold them to something. So again, having soft deadlines can then also help with that component if people are missing deadlines, so that in order to keep the assessment train moving forward, you're not going off the tracks because somebody missed a deadline or was too busy doing something else in order to meet what you had proposed. So having some cushion built in there to accommodate for that is definitely recommended. Another component that you want to, as much as you can, draft templates for the work you're going to be looking to do, because both with faculty and staff, it's always nice to have something in front of them as opposed to just a blank template. I'm sorry, like a blank slate. It helps to give them some form to work with, even if it's a form that they take and then they come back to you and say, I don't like this, or this doesn't make sense to me. Again, it's probably better than just telling them, yeah, write an assessment plan or come up with your outcomes, because they may not know where to start. What's best is having a template that they are invested in or that they help create, which can come down the road, but initially getting started, you want to provide them with some resources. So again, as you're working with them and looking to get assessment efforts moving forward and some formal documentation, that you have something to provide them. And again, if nothing else, it's something for them to give feedback on. And while there's all sorts of templates and resources you could create for them, if nothing else, having a template for planning and reporting is helpful. So again, you can show them where the process starts and where the process is looking to end. And as you do that, one of the things too, obviously a template can have components spelled out, but don't leave them wondering what plans or reports should contain. Give them this additional context or elements to frame their work. This can help reiterate that assessment work is practical and that it's important, and it's answering general questions for them. So you can see, taken that who, what, when, where, how, and just listed some potential areas for when it comes to assessment planning. So who, the area, services, what, what their process objectives or program outcomes, as well as student learning outcomes, where, what services or interventions do the program and learning outcomes connect to, how are you going to measure those different things, and what looks like success, what are the learning targets for those areas, and then when, having a timeline so that they know when they're going to be assessing one thing versus another, and potentially even how they're going to be breaking this work up over multiple semesters or multiple years. And again, by putting things within that context, it can also just, even if your template has all that information, it can help them see why it has those things, and that you're not just asking them to produce certain documentation components, but that they all serve a relevant purpose. Same thing on the reporting side. Reporting can be as simple or as complex as you want to make it, and especially with templates, it may differ from one area to another. But what's important is just underlying the basic component of having some form of documentation of what was done, who the area that was involved, and what they were doing, what they were trying to measure, why it was important to them, and why the results might be important to somebody else, and then what they're going to do about it. Actions they might be taking, future plans for assessment, other areas that they're going to involve. But again, aside from whatever templates you may have, framing it in this way can also help them, especially if you're providing these templates that they haven't given any feedback on, or that they may not like, or that may not make sense to them. Reiterating some of these components in relation to your template as well as in general can be helpful, so that even if your template isn't ideal for them, they can potentially make it work, or at least come up with their own, so long as they're still answering the core components. And as I alluded, there's all sorts of other resources you could have on deck and ready to go as you're engaging these folks. I know for me, aside from templates, I have like a writing learning outcomes worksheet or tip sheet, a document that explains or overviews different assessment methods. I have some past examples of content from different offices to help jumpstart folks, or if they're wondering what this might look like for a different area, as well as various old PowerPoints and presentations that I could just quickly adapt for the new case. It's always helpful to have those tools on hand because you're going to encounter those questions. While some groups may take in the information you're giving them and want to then sit on it and work on it and brainstorm on their own, others will want to see examples, or would certainly appreciate seeing examples or other resources as they look to get started. And to make your life easier, having some of those pieces on deck is definitely beneficial. So we asked earlier where we were in terms of what model you might be looking to utilize, but it's also helpful to think about your culture and where you are, what you're looking to do. So I wanted to see, given the folks on the line, what your current strategy is given your culture. Are you starting from scratch, or completely starting anew? Are you largely taking what you've been doing but trying to formalize some of the efforts, the processes or how the reporting might look? Are you doing kind of operational assessment and looking to expand on the co-curricular side, or I'm sorry, on the learning outcome side, so going beyond usage, needs, or satisfaction? Or are you just trying to make sure you have some all-stars doing assessment work and some doing nothing, so you're just trying to get everybody doing something? Or have you been moving along pretty well with assessment but needing to take the next step, or needing to advance to more sophisticated assessment methods than what you're currently doing? Oh, nice, Marilee. Yeah, she commented that her institution's certainly doing some assessment with the usage satisfaction, but trying to identify learning outcomes and brainstorming ways to measure them. Yeah, and that's where a lot of institutions are. Folks are in different stages of that, or they have they're going with one office that definitely gets it or is a champion of assessment, and trying to get them far enough ahead that then they can be the example to then bring others along. So yeah, it's really just a matter of understanding where you are so that then you can develop an appropriate strategy. All right. Looks like a lot of folks are in that boat of they've been doing some assessment, but a concentrated effort of expanding for learning outcome-based data collection or assessment efforts. And we have some other folks scattered with the other pieces. Thanks for participating. All right, so all of that stuff that I've covered so far, in my mind at least, it certainly overlaps with work being done, but a lot of that can be done on the preparation side of things. Thinking through those components, having resources ready, knowing the approach that you have in mind, and understanding who you may need to talk to get additional insight or even approval for approach. There's specific councils, committees, or entities to let you know whether you have the freedom to create a brand new model or not. But as you're going from that preparation stage to the doing the work stage, it's helpful to set context with folks. So I've been doing this a lot, is just assessment orientation, especially if folks have never heard of co-curricular or what that means, or a lot of times working with faculty when you're talking about assessment of student learning, it's even just clarifying the terminology of an assessment. We're talking about assessment as a process, as opposed to assessment being an individual instrument like a test or a paper or project for a course. So it's key to orient folks to what you mean by assessment, what you mean by co-curricular or student affairs assessment, or how that may look different from what they know of assessment, and describing what the approach is going to be, or at least putting up for consideration what approach you have in mind, and then getting feedback from different folks on that. One of the other components early on that you should try to be clear about and then reinforce as you move along is reiterating responsibility. Let people know both who assessment work applies to in terms of the areas that are going to be involved and who should be taking an interest in this activity, as well as who's responsible for doing what, and defining the roles in the process. One of the things that I try and dispel early on is, as I'm working with folks and they're new to assessment, I try to very quickly stop any of the language or correct them if they say, "Oh, I'm working on this for Joe," or "Yeah, we're doing this survey as part of Joe's project," or what as part of what Joe has to do. But again, assessment, while I'm helping, assessment should be cared about and led and involved by the people in their area. So, enrollment or admissions should be doing assessment for their own benefit, and they should be invested in their responses, because while I care that they're doing assessment, and while I care that they're doing sound work there, at the end of the day, I'm not the one necessarily invested in their results or the most appropriate person to make decisions based on their results. That's for them. They're the subject matter experts of their area, so they need to be engaged and actively involved in this process. And so as you're getting started, it's helpful to reiterate those points and make sure that they understand that they need to be active players and be responsible and accountable for understanding the value of this work and valuing it as they engage in the work moving forward. One of the other things too, this goes back to the preparation piece of understanding how areas are, who's involved and what existing culture is, but again, revisiting folks, and once they understand what assessment is, trying to get their thoughts and help them brainstorm content and plans. One of the other things that, as an assessment professional, you can look to do is try and be that link between one office and another. A lot of times, we're so siloed in our individual areas that, especially when we're tackling something new, if assessment is new, or if you're looking to dive into outcomes-based efforts and that's new for your institution, people will get so invested in their own area that they're not able to take a step back and think how they might relate to or complement another area. And so that's one of the other things that, in working with different offices and helping coordinate this activity, across a division or across an institution, in my opinion, it's a responsibility of the assessment folks to help make those connections where they're not there, or help bridge those communication gaps by bringing those entities together or sharing that information of, look at the learning outcomes of this area, and here's some similarities here, and you also really talk, especially if you're an institution who you're brainstorming different ways to measure outcomes and you're just not sure. Even from an assessment coordination perspective, it's helpful to pair people together so that they're combining their efforts on a like survey as opposed to two very similar surveys going out from two different areas, and potentially risking survey fatigue. So it's always helpful to pair, to try and pair different areas together, and that can come with this kind of learning and sharing, context setting time. And certainly work to align assessment with what else the area is doing. Letting them know how this information is pertinent to them, how it affects their other operations. One of the things I always point to is, if they're not doing assessment, how do they really know how effectively they're operating, right? Are they just operating off of a hunch or their gut? If they don't have data, how do they know? Then a lot of times they'll come back and say, well, we do have data, and that's great. That is, let's formalize how and why you're collecting that data, and start reporting on it, rather than only certain people hearing it or knowing about it. And then also, let's make sure we're being comprehensive and intentional in the process, and not just collecting data on one aspect of the services you provide or the impact your services have. And also keeping, aside from individual areas, keeping assessment in mind with the larger context of institutional improvement as well as accreditation efforts. Accreditation is always a nice stick you can carry to underscore the importance and necessity of assessment, but you have to be careful using that stick, because typically accreditation only comes around on campuses every 5 to 10 years, so a lot of times there's a lot of activity building up to a visit, and then it drops off after the visit. So you don't necessarily want to adhere to accreditation being the big motivation for assessment, because otherwise your activity will be inconsistent over time. And as again, this comes back to the responsibility component, but truly empowering individuals and letting them know that, yes, while you're an active agent in this process, use this process. This should help you to understand how you're operating. Or, an example I have is, at previous institution, there were these student workshops that one area coordinated, and there was the university library that was on its own, and there were these workshops and tutorials about the library that long ago the two areas had collaborated to put together the content, but since then that content had largely become outdated, and the library, when they tried to reach out to that other area, never really got any traction or didn't feel like they could ask for that content to be revamped, because it was part of this other area and they're the ones that ran it. So assessment helped become that link for them to bring their assessment plan or talk about, well, this is our area, this is what's core and important to us, And here's this resource or this intervention that is educating students about us. And if we're not saying we have to own it, but we definitely want to have input in it. And that other area was completely unaware that the library was interested in revising these components. So assessment became this link for collaboration, and also it provided a springboard for the library to take a next step and try to achieve something that they didn't think they were able to do otherwise. Assessment provided leverage for that component. And one of the other things with context setting, it's all fine and good to empower folks at the front line and director level, but you're not going to get too far in assessment practice if you do not have buy-in from institutional or larger leadership that's there. So one of the things to try and do, if you don't have already, is to talk to leaders and frame assessment in ways that make sense to them or can benefit initiatives that they have, or university-wide goals or objectives, and how assessment can help support and provide evidence for those components. Because it's so much easier to execute assessment work when you have leadership buy-in, because then, especially as I mentioned before, if you're an assessment person sort of leading by influence and not necessarily by authority, it's great to then to know that you can go to the boss or supervisor of some area, or the divisional leader, to, if they need to, put their hammer down or send a strong message to folks that assessment is something they should be participating in, and that they should be actively engaged in the process. One of the things that I love in my current position at University of Phoenix is, the president has 5 university objectives, and one of them is world-class assessment. And to my knowledge, this is the first institution that I've worked at that it's a stated, publicly written, available to all the institution president objective for assessment. So it's incredible to be able to always point to that, and as I'm working with folks, building things from the ground up, to be able to point to the top of the institution and say that this is a priority there. So how can you say it's not a priority for you when it's a university-wide objective? So one of the things I wanted to check or give you all the opportunity to reflect on is seeing to what extent you feel supported from institutional leadership with your assessment work. So this could be thinking about whatever is most appropriate to you. If you're within student affairs, you can think about student affairs leadership, or if you want to answer from the full institutional perspective, you can. But just wanting to see how supported folks feel with their assessment work. And it's something too that with this, if you don't feel like you're all that supported, you try to think about ways you can look to seek that support, or who you might need to talk to, or who you can bring along to try and make the case beyond just maybe you, especially if you're an office of one, or you don't have a formal position of doing assessment, but it's part of your job responsibility. Thinking who you can bring along to make it more than one voice to advocate for support with assessment and why it's important. Yeah, Marilee, in one of the things Marilee mentioned how leadership focuses a lot more on academic assessment as opposed to co-curricular, and that's certainly something a lot of institutions have. Is there's offices and websites dedicated to academic assessment, but nothing dedicated to co-curricular, or there's a director of academic assessment, but
there's no formal position on the co-curricular side. It's just something that everyone has to do, and the coordination is handled by those folks getting together to try and support one another. I think it's certainly something that's changing. I mean, knowing that co-curricular assessment-related jobs have been popping up and appearing a lot more often at different institutions, I think that can help change the tide a bit by by there being even positions or people to advocate for this work as part of their job. It can help, and by leadership creating those positions, it's a sign of support. Yeah, and I think Mary Beth's comment about why this might be with respect to accreditation being focused on academics, and Mary Lee's point about keeping momentum going outside of accreditation activities, at least on the HLC side, there's plenty of criteria related to co-curricular assessment. So anyone who says that accreditation is focused on academics, accreditation is focused on proper performance of an institution and educating the whole student. So there's, again, at least on the HLC side of things, there's multiple criteria and or multiple criteria subcomponents that relate specifically and call out co-curricular areas being aligned to the mission, that staff are appropriately trained, that they are executing on the promises or the deliverables that they say they are. So yeah. Good. Well, we have a good amount of folks who feel very supported by institutional leadership. And for the folks who aren't as supported, again, it's one of those things to think about, especially if you're thinking of how to advance your culture. That might be a barrier or something to work towards as well, as beyond engaging the areas that are doing the assessment work. Perhaps where you need to be focusing is looking at the leadership and higher ups that can place more importance on assessment work, and that can open doors to advancing the culture. All right. So we've been working our way through with preparation and setting context and getting ready and gearing up to do the work. So let's dive into actually doing the work. And again, this is from the perspective of an assessment coordinator or leader. I think one of the components here is, again, reinforcing the foundation. Especially if you're an assessment person, it's reiterating that what your role is in the process, so that people are not thinking that you're going to do all the work, or that you're going to be the one to carry the brunt of this work, and they're just supporting, or that it's just a one-time thing. Reminding them of the purpose, the approach, and your role of providing support however they need it, letting them know that you're available to them, even though they've already set their plans, or even though they're already in the process of collecting data. But truly reinforcing your role, as well as clarifying that, again, this goes back to the empowerment piece, that they can let you know their communication style, or how they want to be supported, if they want a regular check-in meeting with you, or if they prefer to be somewhat left alone and you just check in periodically. One of the things I tell a lot of my areas is I want to help, not hover. So I ask them to tell me what they would prefer in terms of communication. And I have some areas that I meet with or communicate with weekly. I have some I meet monthly, and others that if it was up to them, they'd probably be on their own, but I at least check in at least by email once a month, just to make sure all is well and that they're moving along. along those lines, keeping open communication is critical during this as folks are doing the work. Again, it comes back to that idea of you helping them getting started, and once they get going, they may feel comfortable, but making sure that they're doing what they should, they're not forgetting anything, that always challenging them to think beyond what they did. Maybe their first report was a good first try, but continuing to give the next reports and giving them feedback so that as they get more data, they know that they should talk about trends in the data and not just mimicking exactly what they did the first time around. But yeah, just wanting to be kept abreast of any updates or progress being made, especially on any outstanding components that when you met with them last time, they said they were going to check on something and it's perhaps a side component, wanting to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. Again, because if assessment is new to them or new to their area, that you're the one helping to be a reminder for some of these pieces, again, to assist them and get them in the groove and familiar with the process. And a final thing with the open communication, letting them know that it's okay to have that update, even if it's bad news or no news. I have plenty of offices that when I check in with them, they tell me, yeah, we really haven't, nothing has really changed, or we haven't had a chance to work on this, since we last talked. And it's great to hear that. Even though that's somewhat disappointing, it's great to know that they're honest enough to admit that, as opposed to potentially avoiding the meeting or hastily throwing something together at the last minute, but knowing that they put value in the process and that they're at least being honest in sharing bad news or disappointing updates when, and then whenever that happens, just working to find ways to best support them and try and mitigate those pieces for the future. One of the other components too in doing the work is continuously reflecting on building capacity. So a lot of times you nurture folks through in the planning process and getting them started, but thinking about that even when it comes to data collection, even though perhaps they're already running a survey or they already get these certain reports, that they may not exactly know how to take that data and translate it to information, or how to best convey that in a report. So being sure as you're checking in with different folks to make sure they understand what needs to happen and that they feel comfortable sharing where they're not familiar with something or where they could appreciate your support. And again, this goes back to having plenty of resources ready so that you can share these resources with them and ask them if they need more than that as they're advancing or as they're carrying out their work. One of the components too with capacity building is making sure not to overwhelm them with too much too soon. While they may be curious about the end reports, keeping that simple if they haven't even articulated their outcomes yet. But ultimately around the capacity building piece, one of the things that I like to think of is you almost want to work yourself out of a job. You want to, as the picture shows, teach them to fish and make it so that they feel very comfortable and confident with doing assessment work. And when that happens, then you can focus on bigger picture, more sophisticated analyses and projects, because you then have this army of assessment professionals across the institution or across your division. So my job is I always work to get them as comfortable and confident in doing the assessment work as I can, so that then they become other folks that I can look to for projects or presentations or again, being champions of assessment and helping spread that word throughout the university and reinforcing expectations and activity. I talked earlier in the preparation piece about having resources and having templates, but you want to make sure that anything you're providing, that to a certain extent it's reactive, that you're able to adjust these things. And so perhaps everyone gets started with their assessment planning, and after everyone has a plan, you check in with folks and get their feedback about the template that they used. Was it helpful? Are there ways that we can improve it? Or again, when we think about capacity building or training, we shared with you this writing outcomes document, and I thought it was helpful. It was great for me. It's worked for these other people. Did it work for you? Is there something we can do differently moving forward, or as I onboard a new area, or a way that we can fine-tune this process so that it's easier for you next time around? So getting that feedback and making sure that you have some flexibility and that you're comfortable with the fact that some of these resources may change over time, because truly they should meet the needs of your folks. So be flexible and be aware that you may be having to put in that work to create new drafts or new versions of things. And like anything else, as you get going with this work, you may need to continue to expand and build upon the infrastructure. So we talked about getting this far. Even just getting started with the process, you're going to have to see what types of assessment projects people are going to be working on in order to then know what type of infrastructure we need to support it. So beyond this mental framing, you're going to need to think of the technological and physical reinforcements for this work. So as people start collecting data, thinking about databases, warehouses, potential for automatic reporting that could be developed. Yeah, thinking about existing components like portfolios and reflection papers to be capturing this information or housing or centralizing some of this data. And another component of infrastructure is adding to existing processes. If we talk about an emphasis being on the academic side of the house, thinking where appropriate, adding co-curricular people to existing academic committees or assessment spaces. And if it's not appropriate to add to that group, then potentially creating your own student affairs assessment committee or subgroup within that component. Those pieces may come later or down the road once there's a little more pieces in place. But again, thinking of that infrastructure of what's going to be sustainable, what's going to be appropriate, and reflecting to make sure that not only are folks feeling supported, but they're also they have the space to engage and collaborate as needed. One of the biggest things I've been talking about thus far, I've touched on a couple different times, but constantly seeking feedback. Hopefully it's not like this guy, but looking to engage folks to, one, make them feel comfortable that they can give feedback about the assessment process and about the way you're working with them and about the resources. But two, we're not going to be able to improve these components without this feedback or without this this direct interaction with the folks who are doing this work. Because no matter what the assessment folks think is great, it's just like certain models working on some campuses versus another. You need to meet the culture, you need to meet the needs of the people that are doing the work. So making sure that there's this open line of communication and folks feel comfortable giving this feedback and seeking the feedback even if they're reluctant to give it or they didn't think to give it because they're so focused on the results they're getting and they're not even thinking about the assessment process that they that got them this far. All right, so we've been getting through doing the work, and so now we're getting to this idea of next level assessment. Before we dive in, I'll just pause. I know some folks have been chatting different things, but any questions at this point before I move on? Okay, seeing none. I'll keep going, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions here as I get through this content. But moving on, thinking about next level assessment, one of the components to keep in mind is, as you're thinking of your model and thinking of your existing approach, always be thinking about the future and thinking of what's going to need to happen down the road. So, maybe your most immediate concern is just getting people doing assessment or getting them to articulate their outcomes. But framing things in a way that you're setting your sights on the future and setting yourself up for success to take that next step and advance to the beyond the basics. So knowing, well, this area does a lot of operational assessment, so let's get them doing that and feeling comfortable with their formal articulation of that work and their formal reporting of that work, and then having them expand to learning outcomes. But having that end goal in mind and having that next step ready for your different offices or for your division is helpful. One of the things that I've done with that is with some of the assessment planning templates I've created for folks, I built in the relationship between some of the elements on that plan with the CAS standards, so that in my mind I'm thinking down the road, once assessment's up and running and everyone's comfortable with that, start to integrate this programmatic review component for co-curricular areas. And so I'm already setting that foundation and familiarity with CAS to potentially use that CAS framework and their self-assessment guides to do that programmatic review now, by already integrating some of the relationships of the CAS information with that assessment plan content. And if nothing else, it's also introducing the CAS standards to folks, and maybe by the time we get to a place where we're ready to do some type of programmatic review, maybe they won't want to use the CAS standards, but if nothing else, then I can use the CAS standards as an example, and then if we're going to develop our own thing, we can. But again, thinking of what those next steps might be and how you can be both preparing with resources as well as preparing and making sure you're ready to engage different areas to go to that next step. One of the other things in terms of next level assessment that you can encourage people to do is just doing more, doing more outcomes-based assessment, or making sure that their outcomes are comprehensive. Maybe as they were getting started, you wanted to keep things simple, keep it focused, and so they only articulated a handful of outcomes, or they only started measuring a handful of outcomes. Pushing them to measure more. And I'm not saying increase activity for the sake of increasing activity, but if they're not measuring all the components of their area, that means they're operating without some data in some areas. So making sure that they're integrating those components into their assessment plan. People don't have to measure everything all the time, but they should be measuring everything at some time. So that's one way to also push people to do more, is, or push people to the next level, is by encouraging them to do more. The other piece is, with adding activity, you can also look to encourage multiple measures so that you can triangulate data sets, and that you're not necessarily always making all your decisions based off of one measure or one intervention, but that you're seeing where it could tie into other pieces or complement or tell a richer story, and integrating those pieces. Likewise, you can always encourage folks to sort of do these deep dive projects when you're doing assessment work and they're reporting and they find peculiarities, or they'd like to, they make a note of, I wonder about this, or it'd be interesting to see that. You can encourage them to keep those notes and tuck that away or put it off to the side, and then when they're ready or when they feel comfortable enough, letting them do these deep dive sort of follow-up projects, and see what they find and go beyond their base assessment plan to these side avenues and side projects. And yeah, Marilee noted visiting existing institutional data for triangulation. Absolutely. Seeing how results for learning outcomes of orientation correspond to course progression or first year retention. One of these other elements of next level assessment can even just be ensuring assessments infused in day-to-day culture, having it be part of regular meetings, making sure it's integrated in elements around planning or decision-making or resource allocation, but that assessment becomes less of a project and less of a foreign component, but truly is integrated in with everything else they're doing. That's a sign of a truly healthy assessment culture, is when it's that present and everyone understands it and it's a regular topic and doesn't seem foreign or special or new, but that it's just part of the everyday vernacular. It can take a while to get that, but that's one of those next level components you can work towards, is getting it as a standing agenda item at one meeting, and then at two, and then at multiple offices. And as I alluded before, assessment can be a great way to build collaboration and to be leveraged to increase collaboration, whether that's from office to office within student affairs, or even crossing the divide between academic affairs and student affairs. So thinking of ways that you can elevate the conversation and involve more people about what's going on in terms of assessment work, who's involved, and what it could pertain to. Again, this goes back to that idea of using existing data sets, encouraging people to do more. That more component could even just be sharing more with other areas or other offices, or engaging new stakeholders in data. And I'm getting ahead of myself because the next slide is sharing. So obviously, base assessment work is that they're doing the work and that they're reporting and perhaps sharing most immediately, but then that next level can be that they're sharing to more audiences. So aside from just sharing internally, they're looking to share back information and results with students or with other external entities. Perhaps maybe they're getting the confidence to take their results and share it at a conference or in an article, but encouraging them to share and talk about the assessment work that they're doing in different ways. But yeah, absolutely, Marilee. Looking to start sharing on social media and engage a wider audience in the work that they're doing or the results that they're finding. And again, this only helps reinforce the assessment infusion component and the collaboration, because you're continuing to build that culture and make assessment a regularly known and shared or discussed topic. Alluded to before, as we're looking at capacity building in doing the work and reactive resources, one of the things to think about as well in next level assessment is having more sophisticated or advanced development opportunities. So that can be, that can be updating existing resources, making sure to enhance or add to what you already have, or it could be creating formal opportunities. So maybe as you went along with folks initially, you were providing support to them as they needed, but perhaps in the future you are creating a formal professional development series that people can go through and perhaps get a certificate or get recognized, but that you can take these elements of capacity building and professional development and expand on them, so that, again, it's just providing more sophisticated support for people looking to do or be involved with assessment work. And a very important component that is often neglected with assessment work, but can reinforce the culture as well as show that you're doing more than just the basics is making sure that you integrate some recognition with assessment activity, and making that both informal as well as formal. If you have divisional retreats or divisional planning sessions, taking those opportunities to try and call out people who've done a great job with assessment, or informally, sending a weekly note of your assessment all-star. But again, that only helps boost morale as well as reinforce positive behaviors. So don't neglect recognition. It can be something that seems small or seems frivolous in relation to all the work you have to do assessment-wise. So again, this is why I put it in the next level component, that you make that an intentional focus once assessment is up and running, that you try and find ways to build that in and engage folks more formally in those components. So given those next level pieces, I wanted to see which meant the most to you, or which seems, if you were assessing your assessment culture, which is the area you'd like to grow in more moving forward. And I combined a couple of the slides just because I'm limited by the answer options to fit it A through E. So please excuse the combination of some of the ideas. And I'm sorry also you're being forced to pick just one. But perhaps it's the one that you're most committed to, or you'd most like to see happen given your existing culture. Oh, good question, Shane. Student activities offices, there's a lot of different ways you can look to assess them beyond usage or attendance. It depends on what you're looking to, the angle you're looking to go. A lot of areas, a lot of campuses for student activities measure student leadership, and to them they're looking to assess the outcomes of people that are involved as officers or leaders within specific organizations. Some areas also look at specific outcomes and impact of certain events, whether those are intentional university events or organizational events. Another way you can look at it is a lot of times institutions have student activities and student organizations broken up by specific categories. And so with those categories of, like an honor society or a social organization, you can have some built-in outcomes or expectations for performance of those organizations. And then you can look to measure that. You could build that in as part of the sort of organization reaffirmation process as they, look to be re-upped for the next year or have access to the system or resources or be recognized as an official organization. You can encourage them to, you could ask for them to reflect on their activity or turn in like a report where you're getting firsthand results or feedback and data from them about specific components based on their organization. Yeah, there's a lot of different options there. It somewhat depends on exactly where you're looking to go for student activities, as well as what student activities look like on your campus. You may have a separate student leadership component, and so then that might, you don't want that to steal your thunder. You don't want to steal their thunder by trying to co-opt that for your use, but if that's the case, then you might focus more on the student organizations or campus-wide events that you're running. All right, so looks like most people, there's even some of the comments here, most people are wanting to grow in the reporting and sharing area as well as the assessment and fusion. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to grow in those components, and reporting For me, I try and get folks just most immediately reporting throughout their area and to their supervisors, and then once they're doing that, then I start pushing and encouraging them to share out to different related stakeholders. And I'm always pushing and encouraging them to try and share back with students, because they often are the subject of the assessment that's taking place, and so we should be letting them know what we're finding and what changes we're making as a result of that. And that sharing and reporting process can look very different. There's a lot of opportunities to explore there. All right, so I'll run through these lessons learned because they're rehashing some of the things I've mentioned along the way. But as I said, being prepared is huge. Having templates, because people don't work well with kind of a blank slate. Having examples ready, whether that's example outcomes or example reports, or just other campus examples as inspiration, validation, or guidance as they're working to accomplish the task. One of the other components is having analogies ready. So if if they're most familiar with academic assessment, being able to translate or draw parallels between co-curricular assessment and academic assessment. And just being able to relate things and put things in their language so that it helps them understand. And using downtime, whenever you have downtime, using that to prepare for next steps or refining resources or planning for the future. Next, set reasonable expectations, especially if you've been, like for me, the trap I always fall in is I want people to be, especially if they get it, I want them to be moving at a speed that they may not be accustomed to. So it's always reminding yourself to build in those soft deadlines, know that they're, appreciate where they are in the process, that they're new to this, or that they have not been doing this, or likely haven't had formal training within assessment. So keeping that frame of mind and knowing what's reasonable given where they are. Now that doesn't mean you can't set different expectations for different offices. And maybe you have an all-star office, and so you set a higher bar for them than for the office who never does any assessment work. But again, it's having those reasonable expectations for the entities you're working with, so that you don't become frustrated, and that you can continue to reasonably move them forward at a progress level that is appropriate. Along those lines, stay flexible. I mentioned before about the resources and support components that you may want to reevaluate or get feedback on to identify where changes need to be made. You also want to allow for assessment plans, content, measures, and reporting cadences to be revised or changed. It may be that somebody starts looking at results for, let's say, a survey. They decide they're going to, it's an ongoing survey, and they want to look at the results quarterly or once a semester. Well, when they get that report, they may see from the data that there were big problems or things that they could have changed earlier on, and they wanted to change those things and react to them earlier on. So then moving forward, instead of measuring or looking at data quarterly or once a semester, they're looking at it maybe once a month, or if they were doing once a semester, they're maybe looking at it every couple months, and vice versa. Maybe they started out looking at data monthly and then realized, well, we don't really see a whole lot within the month. We really need a couple months to see a trend or to get the volume in order for this data to make sense. So they might elongate their reporting cadence. But allow for flexibility there. So long as they have reasons and they can justify it based off of their findings in the data, then it should adjust according to their need. One of the other things, especially if you're as an assessment professional, make sure you are advising and not acting. Remember, they need to do the work. You have to show them how and teach them and guide them and support them, but they should be the ones leading the assessment work and making big assessment decisions. Again, they're the subject matter experts for their area. Don't fall into this trap of doing the work for them, or it'll take longer for them to learn it, and more importantly, longer for them to eventually own it. I included this comic here which says, we'd save a lot of time if you just leave it all to me. A lot of times, especially if it's an area that is really dragging their feet or not doing the work, it can be very frustrating when you know that you might have the ability or the resources to do certain things for them. But again, then you're not helping them out by doing that. So remember to, as much as you can, advise, don't act. You're there for support, but they need to be doing the work. Being patient is huge. Be patient. You're going to sound like a broken record. It's going to take time for people to get things going. Progress will be slow. Meaningful change won't happen overnight. So be ready for that. And this goes back to the setting realistic expectations. And holy cow, I have just been jammering on and on. Just had a reflection question of one tip or lesson learned you might share from your own perspective, or share to somebody else. Also had a slide on some helpful resources. There's many beyond this, but these were some good books that are out there right now, and some older books. And yeah, make sure to put down here, there's leverage the wisdom of assessment communities. There's assessment communities with NASPA, ACPA, the Assess listserv, the SAAL listserv. Use your colleagues for sure with getting assistance and just getting another perspective for assessment work. I apologize because we're right at time, but here's my contact information. I can stay on the line and answer any questions people have, but feel free to also contact me with any questions or comments or concerns you may have.